Queridos amigos, ¿cómo están? Es un placer estar con ustedes nuevamente y en esta ocasión me acompaña el doctor Marek Matraszek.
It's a great honor to be here, and I'm delighted to be able to speak to you and to your friends. And hopefully this conversation will allow our viewers to understand a little bit more about who Roger was. And your question is actually very interesting, because you asked me, who was Roger as a man? Who was he? And I think one of the most incredible aspects of Roger was that he had so many facets to him. We think of him as a philosopher, but he was a musician, he was an architect, he was a polyglot, he was actually a man of science originally, because when he originally went to university in Cambridge, it was to study natural sciences, not philosophy. He was a composer, he was a musician, he was a writer of novels. So he was truly a Renaissance man. And one of the most interesting aspects of Roger was that he had so many friends in all these different walks of life, and all of them perceived him through the lens of their particular interest. But Roger's genius was that he had an all-encompassing identity with so many facets to it. There was actually very few people actually who knew all those aspects of Roger in equal measure. But primarily, of course, what he tried to do throughout his life was to draw all these strands of intellect together, and to give a common view, a common understanding of what it is that brings them all together. He was not purely a philosopher. He was also a writer, as they said, and we'll talk about this a little bit later. But I think that was the most important thing about him. He was the most genuinely, widely educated and read individual, I think, that many people have ever had the privilege to meet. And he was a remarkable man. And that's even without talking about his own personality and his private life and so on, which is a separate issue. Again, very interesting man.
Wonderful. Yes, actually, well, I had the chance to know him, not to the extent you knew him. I knew him briefly as a student at his Scrutopia Academy in 2018. The last one he did, in fact, himself. Yeah, it was in Wiltshire. Very nice experience. Now, Marek, according to my brief research, you met Sir Roger in 1984. If I am mistaken, please correct me.
Symbolic year. We met in 1984 in communist Central Europe. And I love saying this anecdote because it reveals so much about who Roger was, or not just to me, but why he was interested in Central Europe. I was actually at that time teaching at the Catholic University of Lublin. I went over for a year to teach English at the Catholic University, as we all know, the only independent university under communism from the Elbe to Vladivostok. It was run and funded by the Polish Catholic Church. And I was walking down the corridor one day, and I saw a sign on a notice board saying that an English professor called Roger Scruton would be coming to give a talk about Kant and Wittgenstein. Now, I always say that having been educated at Oxford, I had no idea who Roger Scruton was, because he was, as you know, at that time, already experiencing isolation in academia because of his conservative views. And although he was an incredible intellect and a well-known teacher of philosophy, he wasn't broadly known outside his narrow intellectual environment. And I went to the lecture and I introduced myself, and the first thing he said to me was, do you know any anti-communists in this town? He went straight into what was driving him in his interest in Central Europe, was how Central Europe was living and reacting to the rape of communism. And he was, as you know, at that time, both in the Czechoslovakia, as it was then,
Yes, Czechoslovakia.
and then in Poland and also in Hungary, establishing a network of independent intellectuals, dissidents, anti-communists, who would receive from him and from his network that he set up in the form of the Jagiellonian Trust in regards to Poland and Hungary, and the Jan Hus Educational Foundation in relation to Czechoslovakia, a support, both intellectual and material, for anti-communist independent dissidents in Central Europe. And the group of people that he managed to get together to support him was very diverse. There were intellectuals, writers, in the academics in the United Kingdom, and beyond. And that was actually a very rare event, certainly in the UK. In England, he was one of the very few Englishmen who actually understood that part of the mission as a public person is to offer support to like-minded intellectuals who are facing repression in Central Europe. And so that was my introduction to Roger. And over the next 6 years, until the fall of the Berlin Wall in 1990, he and I and others, many others, worked together to bring support, lectures, underground meetings to key dissident circles in Central Europe. So that was my initiation to Roger. But as I said earlier, it would be very wrong to say that was the only thing that was driving Roger. That was just one part of his life. It was part of a greater holistic approach to the problems of the world as he saw it. But it was a very important part of his life at that time in the 1980s.
Well, actually, he was very fond of Poland. He was very fond of Poland, Hungary, and Czechoslovakia, well, Czech Republic and then Slovakia, because it would be a truth to say that he was instrumental in setting up at least the ideological foundations of what would become the after the fall of the Berlin Wall and the resurgence, in this case, of Solidarnosc. Correct me if I pronounce it wrongly, but Solidarnosc was the movement led by Lech Walesa, and that brought these. It was the first, as Sir Roger refers to it, the first true working class movement in history. Now, Sir Roger was also a man of very strong convictions, although he would not be a militant or a fanatic as they try to portray him always. But he was his feelings against communism were very, very strong. Where did these feelings come from?
Well, that's again a very good question, because it points us to another aspect of Roger, which I think sometimes escapes people. In his opposition to communism, the first reaction is to say, well, that's all about politics, and to focus on the political repression, authoritarianism, the lack of liberty and freedom, and to say that was what was driving him. But that was actually only a small part of why he felt communism was to be resisted, because it reflected his broader philosophical outlook, which was not just political, but also cultural. And I think his revulsion against communism, and perhaps we'll come to talk about this a little bit later, was rooted in his own experience of 1968, because, as you know, during that year he was in Paris and he saw the revolutionary environment of the streets, and he often referred to that experience as really being very formative of his view about communism, which was not just about the fact of repression and the lack of liberty, the lack of free speech and so on. But it was all about seeing communism as being a civilizational rupture, representing a barrier between human ambition, which is really to see the world in cultural, artistic, aesthetic sense terms, and what communism was, which he saw as also being an affront to the normal human nature understood as seeking beauty and solace in the world, as well as the aspect of cultural rewriting of identity rupturing communities from their history, and of course, above all, rupturing societies from the religious motive and the
Yes.
subversion of. So, really seeing communism as being a civilizational threat, not just a short-term political challenge. And that was why he felt an interest in Central Europe, but also what he found in Central Europe through the intellectuals that he supported. He found that there was actually people, academics, dissidents, poets, who were actually understood communism in exactly the same way. And in a sense, they were closer to him intellectually and ideologically than many of his academic colleagues in the United Kingdom and Great Britain, where, as you know, as I said, at that time, he was becoming increasingly isolated within the academic community because of his political writings about conservatism. So he found a certain kinship, an intellectual kinship with the repressed dissidents of Central Europe, and also a great sympathy for the nations of Central Europe because of what they were facing, not just political repression, but cultural and civilizational rupture. And I think that's the important thing to understand about his affection for Central Europe.
Yeah, so we get a very clear idea of, after your first answers, is that we should look at Sir Roger Scruton beyond the political philosopher, because his works are much more fertile in terms of diversity and in terms of their reach. I think that would be one of, if you think it's correct, that would be a preliminary conclusion, to think of Sir Roger Scruton beyond the political philosopher and bring him as a man of culture, as a man of history, as a man of arts, as a man of science, a polymath, actually, who was able to perhaps integrate many streams of knowledge and synthesize them in a very beautiful and clear manner.
Yeah, see, the interesting comparison is often made. He was, as we know, he's very critical of the writings of Jean-Paul Sartre. But funny enough, he actually admired Sartre because he saw Sartre as an archetype, as it were, of what he thought ought to be the nature of a classical intellectual, somebody who, apart from philosophy, was also able to write plays, poetry, to engage in literary efforts. And actually, Roger also felt it was only through looking at these other aspects of civilizational success, whether it was in music or opera or architecture or literature, and he tried to express himself through those modes of perception as well, because he felt that it was only through looking at these other aspects of the human spirit that you actually identify the interesting things that philosophy ought to be talking about, which was something that distinguished him from the British analytical philosophy tradition, which tends to be, or has now become, more and more sterile. And he felt that that was a big error. He was actually very much part of the British analytical tradition, but he felt it needed to be, as it were, supplemented by much more continental sensitivity to culture in order to actually understand what philosophy ought to be discussing and to make it actually useful to the ordinary person.
Yes, and actually, you mentioned Sartre. He was very critical of the thinkers of the left. He actually wrote one book, Thinkers of the New Left, which was rebranded later as Fools, Frauds, and Firebrands, where he criticizes a number of left-wing intellectuals. But as you said, as you mentioned, he admired Sartre. So he was critical, but he was also gallant or great enough to recognize the strengths and the virtues of his fellow, let's say, opposition members. And he, for example, was very he respected very much the works of Eric Hobsbawm, the British historian. He was critical of the way he presented his ideas, but he respected Eric Hobsbawm very much. He respected Foucault. He didn't like at all Lacan, for instance. So, but he was very I don't know what word to use. He was very gentle, and he was a gentleman in the real sense of the word, in the widest sense of the word, because he could recognize strengths, but also weaknesses, but also strengths of his opposition members.
You're absolutely right. And that's a very important point. It was actually a great strength of Roger's, but ultimately it was one of his weaknesses in the sense that his great strength was that he was able to separate out the person from the ideology.
Exactly.
And in many cases, he had a lot of friendships, intellectual friendships as well, with people from the left. And I think this was one of the great interesting things is as people got to know him, and originally, if you didn't know Roger Scruton, you would have thought of him as a very closed mind, a very impenetrable mind, somebody very hostile to the external world. Those who knew him met an incredibly humorous, gentle, open, trusting, and friendly individual whose first instinct to anybody that he met was to extend the hand of friendship. And I think that's another part of his, an aspect of Roger, which is very important to know. And he actually very often, frankly, fell into the trap of trusting other people too much. And as we know, in the final year of his life, there was that dreadful episode.
The New Statesman.
Where exactly he was entrapped by a journalist to whom he approached actually with great honesty and trustfulness. But that was an amazing thing about Roger. He was an incredibly open individual and above all trusting of humanity. And I think that was part of his general philosophical approach, was to rescue humanity from barbarism. And so he sought humanity wherever he could find it, including in personal relationships. And that was, for me personally, it was a great lesson in life and how one should approach other people. So it's a very important part of his personality, which is not known broadly.
Now, we could say that the main subject of study for him, his main subject was the human being. He was concerned with the human being. I think that's why we can use a C.S. Lewis title. He was against communism because it meant the abolition of man, just borrowing the title. It meant that disappearance of man as a complex individual, just being transformed into a number. He appreciated the complexity of people, the beauty that comes from their imperfections. And here we move to the second part of our conversation, which is the legacy of Sir Roger's work. What were his main contributions? So we know already political philosophy to conservatism. He has been instrumental, but I would like to move a little bit further to different fields so people can know other aspects of his philosophy, his contributions in aesthetics, in I don't know. You could bring us much more insights into that aspect. What do you think were his main contributions, if such a thing could be possible?
Well, I think interestingly, what Roger probably would have said that he actually contributed very little. What he was trying to do was to rescue and recover and restore from the past that which is valuable. In other words, he saw himself almost as someone who was replicating for today's audiences not just the corpus of knowledge and bringing it closer to people, but also trying to restore to people a perception of the world which was a humane perception. I think this was the real goal of Roger in his writing and his philosophy, was to actually look at the world and ask the question, what is it that makes the human person unique in life? What distinguishes us from animals? What is it that is unique about the human experience and the human perception of the world? And he was very concerned to explain that really the way in which we perceive the world, the way we see value in it, the way we gain moral strength for what we observe is a very real phenomenon. And he explained that through his work on architecture and aesthetics, on painting, in literature. And he tried to show that these perceptions of the world that we have, these are not false perceptions. These are not epiphenomena of some mental process, but they are a real perception. And one of the tragedies of the world today is the loss of this sense of value, a loss of the sense that through these value perceptions, if you like, we gain an intimation of something which is transcendent, that perhaps we can't see or understand, but we know that there is something which brings value to the world. And that these are not false aspects of false consciousness, as the Marxists perhaps would say, but they are really very true insights into reality, and without which humanity and human relationships could not exist. And he saw a challenge to that, not just from communism, which, you know, through Feuerbach and after Hegel, Feuerbach and Marx had reduced human perceptions to just the materialist view of the world, but also what he saw today as being the other challenge, which was the reduction of the world purely to scientific interpretation, neurosciences, the sense that everything that we perceive is a pure function of chemical responses in our brains. So there is no objective beauty, there is no objective aesthetic experience. And he tried to sort of distinguish those two challenges to what he saw was the core goal of not just of himself, but of education especially, which was really to bring from the past the great achievements of civilization, whether it be in art or literature or poetry, and to hand them on to future generations. Because without that function of education, this is why he particularly was worried about what was going on in schools and universities. He felt that without that transmission of cultural sensitivity and civilizational understanding of the world, that we would literally descend into barbarism. So he was much more concerned about, as it were, recovering, restoring, and explaining civilizational inheritance rather than constructing abstract philosophical theories. And actually, if you read his corpus of literature, he doesn't actually invent any philosophical theory. He wrote a dictionary of political thought. He wrote a magnificent book on the history of philosophy, but he recounts philosophy. He recounts political ideas in order to bring them closer to people who might otherwise not come across them. So he wasn't an original philosopher, but what was original about him was that he was uniquely, and I can't think of any comparative individual who brought together an understanding of all these aspects of human thought into one corpus that he then presented to us and said, here you are, here's something that will help you survive this world. This is my gift to you. And that's how I certainly perceive the 50 or so books that he, and literally hundreds, if not thousands of articles that he left behind. So that was his great contribution, I think, to thought.
Yes, I think he had the virtue of explaining complicated things in very easy and beautiful terms. I think that was one of them. The second one was rejecting this utilitarian and materialistic view, not only of men, but of humanity and civilization and the world in general, and valuing or revaluing or bringing back that transcendence, the transcendental dimension of human beings, the spiritual side of it, which the left always tried to criticize. It still does today in very intense terms, to ridicule this transcendental dimension, which is so much part of us. It is what it makes us humans. It's part of the human condition. And well, besides his this holistic view of humanity, his interventions in music, so he has explored beyond comfortable areas. In terms of his appreciation for tradition, why do you think he was so fond of tradition? It's a word that he uses very much.
Just as in all things, human identity can only flourish in a framework or in a heritage. So we can only flourish, for example, politically, if we work within a corpus of inherited law and institutions. We can only flourish aesthetically if we accept a certain perception or a way of viewing the world. Not to say that we should blindly follow old rules, but those structures of aesthetic understanding are very important in order for us to really understand the world as it is today. And he was a great believer, for example, in the common law in the United Kingdom,
Yes.
which exactly reflected this view that really the way in which, for example, conflict should be mediated is through by reference to the corpus of case law, of common law that had been evolved over centuries as a way of mediating conflict. And I think this was his real sense of what life was about, was to reject the view that life is about conflict, which is the automatic consequence of accepting the Marxist dialectical view of historical progress, where there's a constant conflict with the past in order to bring you to a sort of future nirvana. In fact, he said that, you know, the role of politics and the role of culture and of tradition is really to bring compromise and consensus into our lives, and actually bring about peace through understanding that we are part of something which is greater than ourselves, and that we only exist today because of the work of the intellectual work, the aesthetic, the cultural work of the past. And that is something that should be nurtured, it should be honored, it should be clarified to the current generation and passed on to future generations. Because as I said earlier, without these civilizational achievements of the past, our future is literally nothing. So he was not an uncritical reactionary. He recognized the evolution of history, but he recognized that evolution had to be undertaken within the constraints of a more broader moral and civilizational order in order for relationships not to rupture completely and lead to chaos and atomization. So he was very, very concerned about the cultural inheritance of the West and the incredible value that needed to be protected and passed on to future generations, which is why he was actually so critical of what was going on in universities, of the questioning of civilizational inheritance, of trying to ideologize it either through the lens of class or of race or of sex. He felt that these were very, very divisive ways of looking at reality. They were actually a falsification of something which was very rich, beautiful, and the source of great consolation to ordinary people who wanted to find their place in the world as it is today, surrounded by the people that they love. And that was something that he really thought ought to be very, very strongly protected.
Yeah, oikophilia, no, the love for home. And well, what would you think after all these your beautiful words? You can tell that we can tell that you have imbued yourself with a lot of Sir Roger's readings, and well, yourself is also the way you express them. It's very nice. I hope my audience appreciates the way you have expressed these words, because they have been put very beautifully. These times are very hard times. These times are times of change, but a certain type of change, not that the gradual change that Sir Roger was fond of or he thought was the best way of changing, through gradual reform, but not. This is a change. This is a period of disruptive change. What do you think people should consider looking at Sir Roger's works in periods like this one?
The best way of understanding or drawing upon Roger is actually to look on his lesson not in the way we traditionally look at philosophers or thinkers. We always try to say, well, what was the grand idea? What was the big idea that a philosopher had, and what is the lesson that we draw, and how does that dilute into the basic aspects of everyday life? And certainly, there is a temptation to view Roger that way, because, as I said, he had so many aspects to him. But I think he would be rather critical of that approach, because he would say, well, that's the way of ideologizing life, to come up with an idea and make the facts of everyday life try to fit the big idea.
If you allow me briefly, actually, he didn't conceive conservatism as a political ideology, but as a way of being, as a common, as an attitude.
So I think, so my main point would be, in contrast to that approach, Roger would say, well, let's start from you. Let's start from you and your relationship with the other person, your closest family, your friends, your neighbors, and try to discover what it is in that experience of the other individual, literally the other person that you encounter in your everyday life. And what is it that you start to understand from when you have a relationship with an individual? And that's a very important, that's a fascinating way of looking at Roger's intellectual contribution, because it starts from something which is very personal, not from the abstract ideology, but from the concrete individual. Mm-hmm. And he would say, well, as you look at a person, you see a face. And what does that face imply? It implies there is something beyond the purely physical. There is a personality. Well, if you have a personality, how is that expressed? And what is the relationship I need to have with that other personality? It has to involve respect, and it has to involve mutuality, and a recognition of something which is more than what is just an appearance of a body. So then you start to think about, well, what is it that makes a personality? What is it that forms a person? And what are the things that we should start to look for in life when we look at our surroundings, whether it's our community, our homes, our village, our city? What is it that we find valuable in our surroundings? And what is it that we need to do to make those surroundings humane and friendly to us? Just as we are friends with an individual, we want to be friends with our community, with our village, with our town, with our buildings. And what is it that we find that is valuable in order to make our life worth living, to console our existence, and to make it acceptable for us to live? And then once you start to perceive or understand the world in that sense, from bottom up, as it were, you suddenly begin to understand what Roger's philosophy was about, which is all about looking for the humane around us, and to looking for those fragments of civilization and the surrounding order that, in order to make life livable, had to be protected and developed. So then you start to talk about, well, what is it that makes us love our community, our country? Why do we love our country? Well, it's because we are like each other, but we also have institutions that represent something in our country. Those institutions, such as the heads of state or the legal system, these need to be preserved because they are a condition of for an individual and security and a secure existence. So all of these things start to come together, but they're built up from bottom up, as it were. So I think, again, this goes back to what Roger discovered and expressed very strongly towards the end of his life, which is that really our worldview starts from ourselves and our communities and our villages and our friendships and our families, and that's what needs to be preserved above all. But we can draw very, very deep philosophical conclusions from the way in which we as individuals experience the world, and that's what he tried to bring out in his book. So it's a reversal of how most people view the world. They start from the grand idea, and we all know that that's how the destructive ideologies of the 19th and the 20th centuries emerged, and the ideas of trying to create an abstract way of looking at the world, and then to try to impose that abstraction on living humanity, which led to so many in the 19th and the 20th century. And we still see ways in which that human impulse to liberate oneself from one's own existence even today. So I think that's the big lesson to me from Roger's thought, and it's as I say, it's almost a Copernican revolution in the way in which philosophy is normally understood.
You are a member of the board of directors of the Sir Roger Scruton Legacy Foundation, and it's this foundation that has been created to perpetuate his works. How can people from Latin America that are interested in Sir Roger's work be part of this community?
Well, it would be very fitting, and Roger would be delighted, to know that there was, that the Latin America would also be interested in his thought. Sadly, before his final diagnosis of cancer, it was to Latin America.
Brazil.
Last official visit to Brazil at the end of June 2019. So that has a special would have had a special meaning for him. Well, yes, the Roger Scruton Legacy Foundation was established in the United States in order to preserve, archive, but also propagate the thinking of Sir Roger. There's a huge amount to get involved in. There are not just sources of Roger's writing, but also webinars, seminars, book clubs. Hopefully after the COVID crisis, conferences and meetings will be held to celebrate Roger's thought, but also to talk about the way in which he viewed the world and try to bring that closer to others through bringing together like-minded individuals, philosophers. In other words, honoring Roger's writing itself, but also treating his thinking and writing as a legacy that it is our obligation to carry forward and to bring to ever more broader audiences. So it's a very noble enterprise. I encourage you to get interested. It was established with the approval of Roger's widow, Lady Scruton. So it's something that I think would be of great interest to anybody who is both interested in Roger, but also interested in his worldview. And to bring that to a broader audience, very much encourage you to participate in this activity.
Marek, it has been a wonderful conversation. Thank you for your time. What do you miss the most about him? And just we will close with this one.
His smile and his affection at a personal level. Mm-hmm. And intellectually, I miss his guidance. He had a very major impact on my life at a personal level. But overall, I miss the companionship. I think if Roger were to be with us today, he would say that was the most important thing that he brought out of relationships was companionship and friendship. And to use a favorite word of his, reconciliation and consolation. Because it's through the development of human relationships and human friendships based around the things that we love together that we can make our world more livable and more fulfilling for us for the short time that we're here enjoying the gift of life.
Marek, thank you very much. Big hug to Poland, and I hope to see you at some point soon.
Thank you very much. Hope to see you at the next Scrutopia alumni, perhaps.
Perhaps. Who knows? If COVID-19 permits.
Thank you. Thank you so much for your hospitality, and a pleasure to have been talking to you.